thank you for coming to the Catholic Information Center. We're going to start relatively on time here, and I know more people will come in, and we'll welcome everyone to take a seat. But I would like to welcome all of you to the Catholic Information Center, especially those of you for whom it's your first time visiting. Please feel free to come back anytime. We're open. We have Mass every Monday through Friday at 12:05, and many other events you can find out on our website. If you haven't signed up on our newsletter list, you can do so before you leave. This is one of our many women's, not only women's events, but many panel events on the HHS mandate here at the Catholic Information Center. It's such an important issue for us of religious liberty here in our nation's capital, and we're very pleased to co-sponsor this with the help of Catholic Voices today. And they've sponsored the reception that'll follow, which I hope you'll all stay and enjoy with us. It's my pleasure to introduce Kim Daniels, a Catholic Voices USA coordinator, and she will be moderating this discussion. We're sorry that Catherine Lopez couldn't join us due to a family emergency this evening. Kim Daniels has practiced law on healthcare rights of conscience and is former counsel for the religious liberty advocacy group Thomas More Law Center. With Helen Alvarez, Kim was one of the two main writers and first signers of the open letter to President Obama, Secretary Sebelius, and members of Congress, which I believe has received over 26,000 signers, or is it closer to 30 now? Closer to 30 now. WomenSpeakForThemselves.com, and anyone who hasn't signed that, any ladies who'd like to, go for it. I'll just mention one part of it here where it quotes, "No one speaks for all women on these issues. Those who purport to do so are simply attempting to deflect attention from the serious religious liberty issues currently at stake. We call upon President Obama and our representatives in Congress to allow religious institutions and individuals to continue to witness to their faiths in all their fullness." So it's because of this witness and that we've brought these ladies to join us here on this panel to give us more of an insight about what to expect and how to best combat this problem for the Catholic Church. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks to Mary Rose and to Father Arnie and everyone here at the CIC for allowing Catholic Voices to help kick off this Fortnight for Freedom, which is so important, as I know you're all aware. I first want to tell you a little bit about Catholic Voices because we are a brand new group. We just started here in the U.S. about a month ago. There is an organization in the U.K. that was the original Catholic Voices, and now it's spreading around the world to Mexico and Poland and Spain, and has really a great project. It's very much in line with the Fortnight for Freedom, which I see as a grassroots, parish-based, diocesan-based effort. And Catholic Voices, our goal is to make the Church's case in the public square as lay people who know and love our faith. Our job is to be authoritative but not official. We're going to stand with the Church. We're going to stand with the bishops across the broad range of issues that are important to Catholics. And that means that we're nonpartisan, and we will deliberately be nonpartisan. We're also not afraid of the media. We see this as a new age where controversy is what brings Catholic teachings to the public square. That's our chance to get our faith into public view. And so when those controversies happen, and certainly we've had plenty of them recently, right? That's our chance to get out there and put the positive case for the Church's teachings in the public square, in the media, make that case in an engaging, compelling, reasonable way that tries to convince people and not antagonize them. In short, this is a new apologetics for the new evangelization. We have all heard about the hour of the laity. We've all heard from Blessed John Paul II to Pope Benedict to Cardinal Dolan and the bishops call for lay people to get involved. And we see ourselves as being at the forefront of that. We would love to draw in lay people and slowly grow this group. We've trained 16 people here in Virginia. Some of them are here tonight. Some of them are here with me today over on the panel. In this approach of positively engaging with the media, getting lay people out there who are knowledgeable about these issues, and we hope to increase that. I see a lot of faces here in the audience who would be wonderful Catholic Voices, and so please, let's talk about it after in the reception, and we'd love to inform you more about it. The Fortnight in this panel, this panel is a great way to introduce the Fortnight, because I think we're very representative of the kind of people that will be speaking across the country over the next 2 weeks. I'm a religious liberty attorney, as Mary Rose said. I'm also, maybe more importantly for the Catholic Voices Project, an active parishioner and a mother of 6 kids who go to Catholic schools, and very much a ground level Catholic, in the pews Catholic. Gail Trotter here is also an accomplished attorney, and the mother, an accomplished mother as well, and she has been involved in these issues. And Lauren Petrone, I know, will tell you more about her background as well. She's also an accomplished attorney and a mom, and we all are familiar with these issues and happy to talk about them today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the HHS mandate, what it is, why it's important, and where we are right now on it. Gail is going to talk a little bit about who's really affected by this and show you some of the groups that are really going to be hit at the ground with fines from this mandate and how it will affect them. And then Lauren's going to talk about other threats to religious liberty that are out there. So with no further ado, let's go into the HHS mandate really quickly. First of all, what is it? In August 2011, the Department of Health and Human Services mandated that almost all religious employers provide abortifacients, contraceptives, and sterilization, full coverage for those procedures and goods and services against their most deeply held beliefs. This was a preventive service under the Affordable Care Act, and those who did not provide these things would be fined $100 per day per non-covered employee. It included an extremely narrow exemption for religious employers, defined as those employers who primarily employ and serve members of their own faith, whose purpose was to inculcate religious beliefs, whose primary purpose was to inculcate religious beliefs, and who fell within the very narrow IRS definition of a church. So in other words, the exemption said the only thing that counts as religious is what happens within the four walls of a church. Obviously, especially Catholics know that this isn't the definition of religion. We are a profoundly institutional church. We exercise our witness and our ministry through our schools and our hospitals and our social service agencies. And so this very much impacted Catholics, but of course people of all faiths as well. As many have said, even the ministry of Jesus Christ wouldn't be covered by this definition. And most importantly, I think this definition, by being embedded in federal law, could ultimately serve as a precedent for other laws and a way to define faith down into something very minimal, such that only a small amount of activity receive protection from government enforcement of mandates that violate people's beliefs. In January, HHS and the administration announced that it would not expand this exemption despite private assurances to the contrary. And instead, they gave a one-year safe harbor for religious groups to, as Cardinal Dolan put it, figure out how to violate their consciences. Obviously, everybody was upset with this, right? This isn't any sort of accommodation. And there was a huge public outcry. And Catholic groups stood united against it. Sister Carol Keehan of the Catholic Health Association said this was a bad decision. And in short, people were united, nobody was happy. And quickly after that, the administration came back with another bite at the apple. And this was the proposed accommodation that was supposed to solve the problem. They said that insurers would provide the coverage for free to policyholders automatically, without enrollment, and that this would somehow get employers out of the question of providing this kind of problematic coverage. Of course, you should not forget that the official rule, the rule I first discussed, was adopted without change. So in the rule, in the book of regulations that we're talking about here, the first rule is what's written out, is what's the law today. This is simply a proposed accommodation, and it's not official in any way. In March, the administration said, we'll accept comments on this. We'll think about brainstorm ways to get around this problem. But again, very few people were satisfied at this point. And here's why. First of all, religious employers are still facilitating access to these objectionable goods and services, abortifacients, sterilization, contraceptives, right? The only way that employees can access these is through virtue of their employment at these religious employers. Number two, we know that nothing is provided for free, especially from an insurance company. And so the premium stream was really going to be the only place where funding was going to come for these goods and services. Now, the administration tried to say that, well, because pregnancy is much more expensive than contraceptives, in the long run, insurers will have to pay less money, and so that will work out fine. It won't cost them anything. We all know, again, that this isn't how insurance companies work. Your blood pressure medication isn't free because it will prevent cardiac disease later on. Your diabetes medication isn't free because it will prevent complications from occurring later on. And in this way, contraceptives will not be free to those who pay the premiums. Most importantly, what happened here was the narrow exemption stayed in place, such that federal law still had this idea that religion only occurred within the four walls of a church. So that if you were a religious employer, certainly if you were a religious individual, you were not exempted from the law. And that is very important. And I think that's the place where all Catholics agree that this is a violation of our religious liberty. At this time, again, and I keep saying this because it'll be important later on, Sister Carol Keehan and the Catholic Health Association, who were important allies of the administration on the Affordable Care Act, I think it's safe to say that without Sister Carol's support, the Affordable Care Act might not have passed. And she, at the time the accommodation came out, she said that she thought it was a good step and that she was considering it, and it went in the right direction. She was fully on board. Again, we'll see in a few moments that that's been a game changer. They've changed their minds on that, and we're at a great place today, in large part because they've looked at this and seen that it's an unworkable accommodation that keeps this narrow exemption in the law. Let me tell you a little bit about why it's wrong legally, because I think the legal case can often get very complicated, and it's important to see how strong the legal case is against it. First of all, it's an unprecedented decision to require religious institutions and individuals to pay for something that they regard as contrary to their religious beliefs. That's Professor Michael McConnell, who is one of the leading religious liberty scholars in the country, not a Catholic, but who really sees this as an unprecedented attack on religious liberty. It's also obviously a political and cultural problem, and it's a problem because it fails to recognize the contribution to the common good that Catholic institutions make. But legally, the case against it is very strong. First of all, free exercise. As you may know, under the case of Employment Division v. Smith, free exercise doctrine today holds that a generally applicable law will not be held unconstitutional if it is generally applicable and if it is neutral. Now, there's a good case here that this isn't a neutral law, but I won't really get into that because I think the case that it's not generally applicable is very strong. And that case rests on the fact that there's a really large exemption scheme within the Affordable Care Act. In other words, the Act doesn't exempt Catholics. It doesn't exempt those who object for religious reasons to providing abortifacients and sterilization and contraception. But it does exempt millions of people because their plans are grandfathered. It does exempt the Amish from doing this because they had objection to providing insurance. It has a scheme of exemptions, but it doesn't exempt this one particular group, people who have this particular religious objection to these goods and services. And so for that case, it's not generally applicable, and I think that that gives it a strong argument that it violates the free exercise clause of the U.S. Constitution. Much stronger case, though, is under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and I think that's a clear winner. And here's what that is. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, in the wake of Smith, said that we should revert to a more robust conception of religious liberty, like the one that we had been governed by for many, many years. And that doctrine says that a substantial burden on religion will be struck down unless government uses the least restrictive means to achieve a compelling government interest. Now, I think that applies, by the way, to federal law. I think that we can all see that there's a substantial burden. As Professor McConnell said, and I noted earlier, right, for the first time, religious believers are being obligated to provide goods and services that they object to against their most deeply held religious beliefs. It's a substantial burden on this. Now, the accommodation is supposed to get past that substantial burden. But of course, as we've already talked about, that's basically just an accounting gimmick. These employers believe that they're still providing coverage for objectionable services. They're still facilitating that coverage. Most importantly, it's very clear that this is not the least restrictive means to achieve whatever government interest is out there. And here's why. It might, in fact, be the most restrictive means, because what you're doing is the government is saying, we think it would be good to increase access to contraceptives. How should we do that? Should we pay for it ourselves? Should we provide it through the Title X clinics and the community health centers that already provide this ubiquitous and inexpensive contraception and abortifacients and sterilization? How should we do it? And what they decided was not to take any of those methods, but instead to take the most restrictive method, which is to say, force religious objectors to provide it themselves, to pay for it themselves, and to facilitate access to it. I think I've seen the briefs. The administration has filed a couple briefs against various lawsuits that are out there, and in no case have I seen a strong argument against the fact that this is not the least restrictive means to accomplish any government interest. Now, the final question is there a compelling government interest here? And I would argue no. Again, the administration would argue that the compelling interest is increasing access to contraceptives, abortifacients, sterilizations. But as I've said before, access to those goods and services is ubiquitous and contraception is inexpensive. And so the question is not just are we increasing access, but to what degree. The Supreme Court has argued that marginal increases in compelling government interest don't amount to compelling interest themselves. And finally, I would note that the real interest going on here is cost shifting. Again, if the administration had an interest in increasing access to contraceptions and abortifacients, they could simply provide it themselves. But instead, what's going on is they're shifting the cost from doing that, from themselves to healthcare, to religious employers. And that's the real interest that's going on here. That certainly doesn't amount to a compelling government interest. And legal analysis often looks to analogies, and the great analogy here is to conscientious objectors in wartime. The government can raise taxes to pay for war. Sometimes it's just to engage in war, and you have to pay your taxes to support it. But government does not force conscientious objectors to wage that war for them. And in the same way, here, government should not force religious objectors to provide these services for them. Finally, I'll say that this broad conscience exemption has a great bipartisan tradition in our law. As I've spoken about, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was a bipartisan attempt to respond to the Employment Division v. Smith decision. It passed the Senate 97-3 and was signed by President Clinton. President Clinton's point man on RFRA, as it's known, Bill Galston, recently said at a religious liberty conference here in town that he thought it was clear that the HHS mandate violated RFRA. Ted Kennedy, at the end of his life, wrote a letter to Pope Benedict saying that he supported broad conscience exemptions. So I will just note that this year, these changes are dramatic changes from the longstanding bipartisan consensus that we've lived with. Finally, where are we today? First of all, you've all heard about the litigation, and I think this was a really proud moment for Catholics when suits across the country, 12 coordinated lawsuits, 43 diverse Catholic institutions stood together to challenge this affront to our religious liberty. And I think it's great that we had large archdioceses, prestigious universities, but also small social service organizations, St. Martin Center in Erie, Pennsylvania, Resurrection Catholic School in Pascagoula, Mississippi, all standing together and saying, we will not let this stand. That coordinated set of lawsuits is out there, as well as a number of other lawsuits. I think today there are some 23 cases, 56 plaintiffs. That's out there, and depending on what happens with the Supreme Court's decision next week, those lawsuits might be our best way to get this decision, this mandate knocked down. You've also probably noticed that universities are dropping their health care. Franciscan University of Steubenville and Ave Maria have dropped their student health care plans rather than have to worry about complying with this mandate. The Fortenberry-Blunt bill is in the House, and while no action will likely happen on that before November, I think that's an attempt to bring back broad conscience protection, and it should be supported by all of us. And finally, let's talk about that big decision that's coming down next week, the Supreme Court decision on the Affordable Care Act. Everybody asks what's going to happen to this mandate once that comes down, and I think there are three possible things that can happen. Obviously, the court can overturn the Affordable Care Act, and we should all see that as a big victory for religious liberty, because the authority for this mandate comes from the Affordable Care Act. If it's no longer law, the mandate no longer applies. The two other options, without getting too much into the weeds on the legal issues, are that the Affordable Care Act is upheld, or that the individual mandate is struck down, but the rest of the law is upheld. In either of those cases, we'll still go forward with these lawsuits because the authority for the mandate is still there. And so again, the lawsuits will be our best chance to defeat this mandate. Finally, let's get back to the Catholic Health Association, and then I'll pass it off to Gail. The Catholic Health Association, during this recent comment period, looked at the supposed compromise, tried to figure out a workable way. They certainly were trying to get on board with the administration and their efforts, and they tried to look at a workable way to come to some solution. But because they couldn't arrive at a solution for self-insured plans, like many archdioceses who have to provide insurance themselves and so therefore don't have an insurer to turn to facilitate access to these goods and services, and because the narrow exemption was still in the law, they ultimately found that they thought the mandate, they reversed their support, and they said that the mandate should be overturned, it should be rescinded. That's a huge step, because now the administration has lost all of its important Catholic allies. Sister Carol, who had stood with them with the Affordable Care Act, received a pen at the bill signing, who had stood with them when the accommodation was first announced, just last week said, we're not going to do it, this won't work. And I think between the lawsuits, and between this Fortnight for Freedom, which will be a grassroots effort across the country in parishes, in schools, all across the country, we're really going to see a pressure on the administration to change this mandate. And so with that, I'd like to turn to Gail Trotter, who's going to talk a little bit about where this mandate will hurt the most. And that's on the ground level with the social service providers who are going to be faced with these crippling fines. I'll just say my kids go to a Catholic school out in Bethesda. It's thriving, and nobody would look at it and say, it's on the margin or it's going to fail. But if my school, I've been involved with it for a long time, and I know that if that school were faced with fines of $100 per uncovered employee per day, it would quickly be struggling, and it would have a devastating impact. And if that's the case for a Bethesda parish school, imagine what it's like for a social service agency struggling in the inner city. And so with that, I'll turn it to Gail. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. As Kim mentioned, I'm Gail Trotter, and I'm an attorney practicing with my father in Tysons Corner, Virginia. I, like Kim, am also a mother of 6 children, and I also write for places like BeliefNet, First Things, The Daily Caller, On Faith, for the Washington Post. And I just have to say that I've been very distracted by the baby. I just love hearing the baby making noises, and I was thinking about the larger principle of that we as women, we as mothers here, we know that our religious liberties are just precious, so precious to us. And we know that our mothers and fathers fought and sacrificed and did lots of things over the years to protect our religious liberties in this country and around the world. And we know that we as women have a strong responsibility to protect religious freedom, not just for our generation, but for that generation and for the generations to come. Kim has done a great job explaining what the HHS mandate is and why it's a serious threat to religious liberty. I will explain why the Catholic Church lives its mission through its institutions, and also why the Catholic Church is particularly affected by the HHS mandate. Why does the Catholic Church serve? Mother Teresa, one of my favorites, frequently said that 5 fingers contained the whole gospel, or good news of Christianity. She pointed to each finger saying, "You did it to me." Where does this phrase come from? In the biblical book of Matthew, Jesus tells his disciples a parable, which is a simple story used to illustrate a spiritual lesson. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me." In this story, Jesus shows how our actions as Catholics directly relate to our faith. Jesus also draws attention to our inactions, and he finds fault with those who do not help others in need. As the world knows, Mother Teresa and her sisters spent decades working with the poorest of the poor and the sickest of the world in Calcutta, across India, and around the globe. She was one of the pioneers of establishing homes for patients with AIDS and HIV. When asked how she could continue to serve those in need over such a long period of time, Mother Teresa responded that she sees Christ in distressing disguise in each of those she served. Mother Teresa may be the most well-known and celebrated Catholic servant of our age, but the church is full of servants. I see you all sitting here. These are the women who work in soup kitchens, the men who build houses for the homeless, the women who donate their legal services for low-income clients, the nurses who bathe the sick, the children who buy Christmas gifts for children who wouldn't otherwise receive presents, and the teenagers who spend Sunday afternoons visiting with AIDS patients at a clinic. These are all individuals who take Jesus' story to heart and act to feed, clothe, educate, heal, visit, and love those who may not have experienced much love in their lives. If individuals are doing all of these good things, why do they need institutions to accomplish these tasks? I'm a basketball player and a softball player, and I know that I can't go on the court and win a game. I need a team. I need team members. And the Catholic Church is that. It has a body of people that come together as members to pool all of our strengths so that we can help those who are most in need in the world. Need material, need spiritually, need in terms of loneliness. And it's the same. The Catholic Church is a team. Catholic institutions allow Catholics to come together and function as a team to serve in their communities, to serve the nation, and to serve the world. The administration would like to narrow the definition of religious activity and faith to what goes on in the four walls of the church on Sunday morning. The worship that happens on a Sunday in a church building is just a small part of what it means to be a faith-filled person. The purpose of Mass is to become more like Christ and then take that into the world and make a difference. We need to strengthen the world by taking Christ into the world, by serving and when we meet people of our faith, of other faiths, and of no faith at all. Catholic organizations are bands of people who come together with shared beliefs and common goals. This is also true of Protestant, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim organizations as well. These organizations do good in our society, and in the words of Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, they provide a critical buffer against the power of the state. Religious organizations have historically been seen as a good thing. They are granted special treatment in our tax laws, for example. Religious organizations can obtain 501c3 status so that they're tax exempt. They're also exempt from certain regulations that other businesses and organizations have to abide by. Catholics gather together during the week to serve our neighbors and give evidence of the love that we have for all people. Through Catholic organizations, we are better able to serve people in our communities, in our nation, and the world. What impact do Catholic organizations have? The diversity of Catholic organizations reflect how vital and necessary their work is in our communities. The plaintiffs in the lawsuits that Kim told you a little bit about are equally diverse. Education is vital for most religious people, and Catholics are no exception. From the Old Testament, we learn that to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. As a mom of 6 kids, I can relate to the importance of education in shaping our children's moral compass and learning their responsibility to our community. The Catholic Church has always viewed education as vital to the formation and development of the whole person. Catholic Church has more than 200 universities serving 750,000 students in the United States. Several of these universities are part of the lawsuit seeking to protect our religious liberty, including the University of Notre Dame, the University of St. Francis, Franciscan University of Steubenville, and in our area, the Catholic University of America. There are also a lot of parochial Catholic schools, obviously. There are 6,980 Catholic elementary and secondary schools. The total Catholic school student enrollment for the current academic year is over 2 million students. There are 1,440,000 students enrolled in elementary and middle school, and almost 600,000 enrolled in secondary schools. 19.3% of students at Catholic parochial schools are racial minorities. Non-Catholic enrollment is about 300,000, which is about 15% of the total enrollment at parochial schools. Hospitals. Jesus taught Christians a new regard for those who were ill. He performed many miracles for the benefit of the sick. Some of the most loathsome members of society at the time were lepers. Jesus scandalized the religious leaders at the time by touching the lepers and healing them. He instructed his apostles to heal the sick, and he demonstrated this himself by healing the lame, the crippled, the blind, and those with various diseases. From the very beginning of Christianity, caring for the sick among us is a special duty of Christians. This healing ministry, thankfully, was not limited to fellow Christians, but instead embraced all who were ill and in need. Currently, there are 600 Catholic hospitals, as I said, in the U.S. That's about 12% of all U.S. healthcare institutions. 5 of my children were born at a Catholic hospital, and our community is well served by our Catholic hospital. About 1 in 6 Americans are treated in Catholic healthcare institutions each year. Catholic hospitals have 120,000 beds, which is 14.9% of the available beds in the U.S. Catholic hospitals have staff of almost 650,000 full-time equivalent employees. Obviously, there are lots of other Catholic ministries. There are about 1,400 Catholic long-term facilities helping elderly people at the last stages of their lives. There are also ministries to feed the hungry, and St. Martin Center is one of these. It's one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit that Kim was talking about. The St. Martin Center is an emergency food pantry that provides food for families that find themselves in a bind, and it helps to give out personal care items too. These organizations also give drink to the thirsty. In the Archdiocese of Washington, there's something called the Global Village Program, which allows people here to adopt a village overseas and help build a self-reliant community. There are also Catholic institutions that shelter the homeless. There are emergency shelters, which provide temporary shelter and respite for people living on the street, and they're operated mainly by volunteers. There are also temporary and transitional residences, which are run by dedicated religious women who have taken the lead in trying to provide this kind of housing to people in need. There's also permanent affordable housing for people who find themselves in a situation where they can't provide their families the kind of housing that they need. Also, there are Catholic institutions that clothe the naked. The Prince of Peace Center is another one of these organizations in the lawsuit that's trying to protect religious liberty. They have a thrift store that allows families to come in and clothe their families and get personal care items for free. And then on the issue of visiting and ransoming the captive, visiting prisoners, what I alluded to earlier, in the Archdiocese of Rockville, there's a prison ministry that allows Catholics to go into these prison situations and bring the light of Christ and help these prisoners to understand that there's hope for them on the other side of prison to get back into society and not be chained by the addictions and problems that they've had previously. Also, obviously, as I mentioned, the Catholic hospitals, there are also Catholic associations of doctors and nurses and other types of healthcare providers. The Franciscan Alliance is one of the plaintiffs and is well represented in this lawsuit as well. And finally, there's the Bury the Dead admonition. The Catholic Cemeteries Association of the Diocese of Pittsburgh allows Catholics to have a cemetery for their loved ones that respects the dead and has a real Catholic vision of the understanding of death and praying for those who have been departed. I've just given you a taste of the variety of Catholic organizations and their impact on our communities. I will end with one more story. Before he had an opportunity to attend Archbishop Carroll High School in Northeast Washington, Roland Halassi was moving between public schools due to problems, fights, altercations, and academic troubles. When he entered Catholic Carroll High School, he became a focused student, and he's ready now to go to college in Florida. He turned his life around. We need more students. We need to give more students like Roland the opportunity to turn their lives around. Our government was not designed to fix all problems and assume responsibility to be the change in our communities. Instead, charitable organizations are uniquely placed to be a force for good. If we don't allow them to function in accordance with their good conscience, we become a weaker society. The threat posed by the HHS mandate is not the only threat. Lauren, I'll turn it over to her now. She's going to share the other threats to our religious liberty.
Hi, I'm Lauren Petron. I am currently a stay-at-home mom of one little boy, but I was previously a practicing attorney. I was chief counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on the Constitution, and while I was doing that, I worked on both the 2008 reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and also on the 2006 attempt at comprehensive immigration reform, both of which are things that will come up a little bit in what I'm going to talk about. Threats to religious liberty in America are unfortunately nothing new. From the Blaine Amendments that sprung up in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to prohibit the use of government funds at sectarian schools, and which, by the way, are in force to some extent in 37 states today, to a recent New York City rule that bars churches, and only churches, from renting public schools on weekends for worship services, there's long been a tension between faith and the government. Recently, we've seen this come into play when the free exercise of religion required by the First Amendment bumps up against what many people view as other important freedoms, like the freedom for same-sex couples to adopt or the so-called reproductive freedom we see touted by those who support unrestricted legal abortion. I'd like to talk about a number of those tension points other than the HHS mandate and how they threaten religious liberty. First of all, Catholic charitable organizations have been pushed out of certain ministries because they have refused to compromise their beliefs. Last year, Catholic Charities in Illinois was forced to stop providing adoption services after providing adoption and foster care services for over 100 years because of new state legislation that would force it to provide adoption services to same-sex couples. The Diocese of Rockford, Illinois, had actually asked for an amendment to the law that would have allowed Catholic Charities to refer unmarried cohabiting couples, both same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples, to other agencies. So they would have been provided a service at another agency, but without violating the Catholic Charities' Catholic faith. That amendment failed. Catholic Charities in Massachusetts, San Francisco, and in D.C. also had to shut down their adoption services because of new requirements that they placed children with same-sex couples. Contrast this with Virginia and North Dakota, which actually get a gold star in this area. Virginia, this April, enacted a conscience clause protecting religiously affiliated adoption programs. This clause prohibits any private agency from being forced to perform, assist, counsel, recommend, consent to, refer, or participate in any placement of a child for foster care or adoption where the proposed placement would violate the agency's written or moral convictions or policies. So that's just one area where, and this is actually, we've been talking a little bit about women and how these things affect women. There are a lot of women out there who are looking to expand their families through adoption, and this is a huge issue and one that's close to my heart because it's a big deal for couples who have experienced infertility. They turn to adoption agencies, and if Catholic Charities in various states can't provide adoption services, there are fewer places for these families to turn. In the context of sex trafficking, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops used to have a contract to provide services to victims of sex trafficking. Between 2006 and 2011, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Migration and Refugee Services had received $13.9 million in federal funds to assist these victims, but they had a provision in their contract that said that the funds shall not be used to provide referral for abortion services or contraceptive materials pursuant to this contract. So rather than providing funding for contraceptives or abortions for victims, Migration and Refugee Services was providing comprehensive case management services to survivors, including medical and mental health services. But in 2011, the Department of Health and Human Services decided we're not going to renew the contract with the bishops. Why? Because the bishops didn't want to refer for abortions or provide contraceptives to victims of sex trafficking. The Washington Post reported that the department's leadership actually overruled its own staff members who wanted to continue the grant to the bishops. And in March of this year, in response to a lawsuit that the ACLU brought against HHS in 2009, a federal district judge ruled that the grants to the bishops violated the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which is just actually pretty crazy. The judge said that HHS violated the Establishment Clause because it delegated authority to a religious organization to impose religiously based restrictions on the expenditure of taxpayer funds, thereby impliedly endorsed the religious beliefs of the USCCB and the Catholic Church. So basically, now, the way that it stands after this lawsuit, which has been appealed, thankfully, and after the HHS decided to just go ahead and drop the contract, if the Catholic Church wants to help victims of sex trafficking, which we do, this is a hugely important issue, it has to violate its beliefs opposing abortion and contraception. The wrinkle here is that in both the adoption examples and in the anti-sex trafficking work, the church was receiving money from the government. So some people might argue that no one is forcing us to violate our conscience. We could just decline to receive the money from the government. They say it's just that if the Catholic Church wants government funds, the Catholic Church has to abide by government rules. But Anthony Piccarello, who's the general counsel for the bishops, points out that Catholics are being excluded from government contracts specifically because of our beliefs. And he says, even though it's true that the church doesn't have a First Amendment right to have a government contract, it does have a First Amendment right not to be excluded from a contract on the basis of our religious beliefs. So we're facing a situation where the church and potentially other religious charities can continue to be forced out of charitable work, where we have great expertise and where we've done significant good in the past, because we won't violate our conscience. The government is basically saying it's my way or the highway when it comes to giving grants for charitable work. Another area that is a big deal right now is immigration laws. And I think that it's important to talk about this because so many of the threats to religious liberty right now are coming from the left. When we talk about things that have to do with marriage and family, when we talk about things that have to do with abortions and contraceptives, those are generally threats from the left. But these immigration laws have been a threat from the right. And as Catholics, we're not partisan. We're Catholic, and that's what we should be first. And so no matter where politically a threat is coming from, we should be prepared, stand ready to fight against that threat. Several states have passed strict anti-immigration laws that could threaten Catholics and other Christians' ability to carry out Christ's commands, as Gail discussed, to do things like feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, and clothe the naked. The best known of these laws are in Arizona and Alabama, but Georgia, Utah, South Carolina, and Indiana have passed similar highly restricted laws, and other states are currently considering them. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops filed a friend of the court brief with the U.S. Supreme Court opposing the Arizona law, and a decision on that law could come down as soon as tomorrow. Maybe. I hope we have an interesting decision tomorrow. We'll see. Obviously, that decision will have widespread implications for similar laws in other states. But I'd like to talk about the Alabama law, which appears to be even harsher than the Arizona law, if that seems possible. The Alabama law makes it a crime for Alabama residents to harbor, conceal, or transport undocumented immigrants or induce them to come into the state. It makes it illegal to rent property to undocumented people, and it changes contract law, prohibiting state courts from recognizing or enforcing contracts between an undocumented immigrant and any other resident if the second party is aware of the immigrant's unauthorized status. There are a few exceptions, which include food purchases, medical services, and taking an immigrant back to where he came from. In Alabama, the Archbishop of Mobile and the Bishop of Birmingham joined with Episcopal and Methodist bishops in suing to block the law. They say that the contract provision of the law interferes with church thrift stores, church daycares, housing and healthcare operations, and prohibits them from performing marriages, baptisms, and providing counseling services to families. They also say that they fear the law may go so far as to make it illegal for churches to administer the sacraments to illegal immigrants, because the law is unconstitutionally vague in defining what constitutes a violation, what the penalties are, and what activities are exempt. It fails to define the terms that it uses, like concealing, harboring, and unauthorized. So would it be illegal, for example, to drive someone to Mass? Would it be illegal to, would it be an encouragement of them to come into the state if you're providing some sort of services for them? It's not clear. It's not entirely clear whether law enforcement officials in Alabama or these other states will actually prosecute religious believers for assisting illegal immigrants for providing basic Christian charity. The language of the statute just isn't sufficiently clear. But where the language of a statute is unclear, courts that are interpreting the statute will often look behind the language at the legislative history of the statute to see what those people who wrote the statute intended to do. And the legislative history is actually instructive in this case. When the bill was first introduced, its author did not allow for any religious exemptions. And then an amendment was later introduced to prevent the criminalization of certain religious activities. In May, the amendment passed in the Senate, and the bill was forwarded to the House with the amendment included. But when the bill reappeared, the religious exemption was stricken from it. And that is the bill that was ultimately approved. So you had no religious exemption, an exemption get approved, it was taken back out, and the law was passed. So a court interpreting this legislative history could reasonably conclude that because the Alabama legislature considered and then rejected a religious exemption, it did intend to criminalize religious charity to illegal immigrants. And like I said, it's important that we speak out as Catholics against these immigration laws because they're evidence that threats from religious liberty can come from both sides of the aisle. Opposition to these laws demonstrates that we Catholics are not engaged in some sort of partisan bickering. That's been said a lot about the Fortnight for Freedom, that this is the bishops just opposing President Obama. This is the bishops supporting the Republican candidates. But we are not, as Catholics, the Republican Party at prayer. We will stand up against threats to religious liberty no matter where they come from. There's no question that our immigration system is horribly broken, but imposing harsh laws that infringe on acts of basic Christian charity and maybe even our priests' ability to administer the sacraments without checking someone's legal status is not the way to fix the system. There have also been threats to individual Catholics. Generally, healthcare providers have been asked to violate their beliefs, specifically relating to assisting in abortions and providing abortifacient drugs. In Washington State, in 2007, the Washington State Board of Pharmacy passed new regulations making it illegal to refer patients to neighboring pharmacies for reasons of conscience. So if they came in, for example, for Plan B, morning after pill type thing, instead of saying, I can't provide that for you, I'm sorry, but here's the pharmacy across the street where you could go, Washington State said, no, you pharmacist, even though you're a Catholic and you're opposed to this, you have to provide this yourself. The law, though, even though it didn't include a conscience protection, you could refer somebody across the street for a variety of other reasons, business reasons, economic reasons, or simply reasons of convenience. We're out of stock on Plan B. You need to go across the street. We don't stock that because it's not profitable. You need to go across the street. But if you're opposed to it for religious reasons, you were just kind of out of luck. A family-owned pharmacy and 2 individual pharmacists sued to challenge the law. One of the pharmacists had been fired from her job, one had been transferred to another state, and the family-owned pharmacy had been repeatedly threatened and investigated by the pharmacy board. The interesting thing about this Washington State case is that these regulations specifically targeted religious believers. The pharmacy board that imposed the regulations had previously voted unanimously to include a conscience protection clause for pharmacists. But when Washington's governor found out that they were trying to include conscience protections, she publicly threatened to fire the board's members. She replaced several board members with candidates who'd been screened and approved by Planned Parenthood, and she personally joined in a boycott of the family-owned pharmacy that ultimately brought this lawsuit. Thankfully, the pharmacists recently won their case. The case was brought by the Becket Fund, and a federal district court struck down the law on religious freedom grounds. Last year, a group of 12 nurses in New Jersey at the University of Medicine and Dentistry in New Jersey had to sue their hospital after it instituted a new policy that would have required them to assist abortion patients before and after the actual abortion procedure. Thankfully, they successfully settled their lawsuit, and the hospital agreed not to force them to assist in any way except where there's a genuine medical emergency and no one else is available. Then they do have to go in and assist briefly until someone who doesn't have a conscious objection can make it in. What's interesting about the New Jersey nurses case, though, is that the hospital claimed it wasn't violating their conscience rights. It said in a statement that no nurse is compelled to have direct involvement in and or attendance in the room at the time of a procedure to which he or she objects based on his or her cultural values, ethics, and or religious beliefs. So we're not doing anything wrong here. But this is just another example of someone attempting to tell Catholics and other believers what our faith requires. We've seen this with President Obama's proposed compromise on the HHS mandate that Kim talked about. He claims that his accounting gimmick should be sufficient to placate Catholics because our institutions will pay for contraceptives, sterilizations, and abortion-inducing drugs indirectly through our insurance premiums rather than directly. This New Jersey hospital told its nurses that their faith only required that they not actually participated in the abortion. It was fine if they helped out before and after it happened. And one manager shockingly told one of the nurses, "You just have to catch the baby's head. Don't worry, it's already dead." The government and other entities trying to tell us what our faith requires of us seems to me to be the height of arrogance. It should be up to religious institutions and believers, not government institutions or anyone else, to define what we believe. There are also a couple more threats that I'll talk about very briefly, threats on college campuses. The University of California Hastings College of Law recently denied student organization status to the Christian Legal Society because it required its leaders to be Christian and abstain from sexual activity outside of marriage. This is the only time in the 100-plus year history of the law school that it has denied student organization status to a student group. And last year, Vanderbilt University adopted a new non-discrimination policy that prohibits a student organization from requiring its members or even leadership of the organization to adhere to a statement of faith. Vanderbilt adopted the new policy after a Christian fraternity removed one of its leaders because he agreed with the fraternity's official stand on homosexuality. Vanderbilt told Christian organizations they had to rewrite their constitutions to remove these leadership requirements. Organizations that refused would forfeit official student organization status. They would no longer be able to use school facilities, advertise their meetings at school events, or apply for student fee funding. In essence, Christian organizations had to comply by compromising their beliefs, or they had to leave campus. At least 4 organizations, including Vanderbilt Catholic, have left Vanderbilt University as a result of this. This one is a little bit tricky because Vanderbilt is a private institution. It's not a government institution, but this action does clearly show the increasing hostility that we see in the public square towards religious believers. These examples, sadly, are only the tip of the iceberg. If you're interested in learning more about various threats to religious freedom, I'd suggest that you check out websites from groups like the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, the Alliance Defense Fund, both of which represent religious believers and institutions in cases where their First Amendment rights are threatened, and those organizations represented the religious believers in some of the cases that I talked about. This issue isn't going away. That's why it's more important than ever for people of faith and other people of goodwill to stand together to protect our first freedom.
Now, you might be asking yourselves, so this is billed as Women for Freedom, and is it Women for Freedom because there happen to be 3 women sitting up here? And I think the thing we all agree on is much broader than that. And that's when we first started hearing about this mandate and about these threats to religious liberty, we heard people start to call this a war on women and speak for us. And as was mentioned earlier, we had this letter, Women Speak for Themselves, that said, along Meg McDonald in the back there has worked very much on it. And we said, don't try to speak for us. Catholic women will not be patronized to. We will not be told that we will sell out our religious liberty rights just for free birth control. And I think we stand together and we say that this manufactured war on women is really an attempt to deflect from these important religious liberty concerns that are at stake. And I think all of us need to stand together against them as they progress over the summer, whatever happens with this mandate. We would love to take a few questions, and then I know there's a great reception out there about Catholic Voices and our project or about any of the issues we've talked about today. Yes?
A great presentation. Thank you. For the viewers, millions of viewers of YouTube who are going to be watching this, can you give some define abortifacient and give some examples?
Sure. Any of you want to take that, or
Go for it.
Okay. The abortifacients that are at issue here are Ella is covered by this, and then what we talk about when we call it an abortifacient is that Catholics believe that once an embryo has been formed, if you prevent implantation of that embryo, you're causing an abortion. And so while some people believe that these act as contraceptives, we understand that prevention of implantation to be an abortifacient method, and that's what we call an abortion. And those are covered. Also, the IUD is covered, and that also prevents implantation. And so to us, that also causes an abortion. And I would say that there, on the FDA packaging for this drug, it says that it prevents implantation. And the second thing I would say is that it's not for the government to tell us what our religious beliefs are. In other words, the science is clear as to what happens, and we're the ones who get to decide whether we think that violates our religious faith, whether we think that's an abortion. And Catholics do believe that.
This question calls for speculation, so the lawyers among you might object to it, but I'll ask it anyway. And I came in a little late, so I might have missed, if this has been answered already, I apologize. But in originally issuing this order, do you do you think that Health and Human Services was suffering from what I call nobody I know voted for Nixon syndrome, and that they thought no one really cares about this this contraception thing, or do you think that they looked out at the country, perceived a gradual loosening of morals on this issue over the years, and thought that just the vast population, or a majority of the population, didn't actually care about this anymore? So basically what I'm asking is, what do you, under what context was this originally issued? Like, what did they think would happen as a result, or as best as you can speculate?
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to speculate for part of it, but I believe I recall reading that Kathleen Sebelius has said publicly that she did not even consider any threats to religious liberty when they were drafting the HHS mandate. Since then, obviously, and since there's been this huge backlash against it, this is the speculative part, the lawyer in me has to say, the administration just seems to be digging in its heels because they know that contraception is so widely accepted. It's so thought to be not a big deal by such a huge percentage of the population. And it's one of those areas where they can sort of say, well, look at those weird Catholics. They don't want women to have something that almost every woman uses at some point in her life. So I think that at this point, they just realize that they have a really great talking point to say that we're opposed to women, that we're opposed to women having something that makes their lives better and easier, and they're just digging in their heels.
I also think that it's part of a concerted effort to get insurance coverage for contraception, and I think that this was, in many ways, just a giveaway to the insurance companies. But I know that pro-abortion groups have been working on getting these laws passed in the states for years, and that it was sort of the getting the brass ring to get the federal government to do it.
Well, and President Obama even said when he came out and was discussing his purported compromise that this is all part of preventive care, and we all know that preventing a disease is cheaper than curing a disease. This whole attitude that pregnancy is a disease. And yes, it actually is cheaper to give a woman a pill every month than it is to provide obstetrical care and then insurance coverage for another child. But it's sort of this idea that it's cheaper for the insurance companies in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm a nurse, and I have just like I guess a devil's advocate kind of question, because I see it a lot. But so right now we're fighting for religious liberty.
Yes.
Meaning I'm fighting for my religious liberty. So the only way that causes a complication when the religious liberty of two individuals come in contact.
Okay.
So what I've been questioned as a provider by my classmates, and obviously I'm very much in this fight, but is, okay, well, fine, you believe that.
Right.
But your patient believes this.
Sure.
And your primary role towards your patient is to take care of their health.
Right.
So if you don't allow them to do what is according to their religious belief,
right,
and AKA their health, because now health is just such
a
an
religion,
ambiguous
right?
term,
Sure.
that you can no longer call yourself a provider.
Right.
So it's it attacks not only my liberty, but also my ability to serve as a provider, maybe an educator if I'm a teacher. You can broaden the scope and say, this is an attack just on religious liberty, this is an attack on objective truth. And I realized when I was having these conversations with my classmates that if we don't agree on something as fundamental as objective truth, these discussions about religious liberty become much more sticky.
They become harder, don't they?
So it's no question. The Constitution protects my religious liberty.
Right.
But when my religious liberty comes in contact with my neighbors,
right,
what happens there?
Right. Any of you want to take this, or I'm happy to?
I would, but you can go ahead.
Well, I'll start, and then you. How about that? I think this is the reason I just want to start is because I want to say this is a great example of why Catholic Voices is such a wonderful approach. And here's why. Because that's exactly the situation where our approach is designed to turn around the question. So you look at the positive intention behind that question, which is very real, right? The person is concerned about their religious liberty of other people. They're concerned about healthcare. Someone wants healthcare and they don't understand why they can't get it. And so what we would do is we would recognize that those are all valid concerns, okay? But it's at the same time, our tradition of religious liberty says that we allow people, when they have an objection to something, to not be forced to participate in it. And so what you would say is you have an option to opt out, right? And you have an option. That person can get their care somewhere else. They have a right, they have an ability to get that care, but they don't have an ability to force someone to provide it to them, to force one individual to violate their conscience, because there are other ways that they can access that care. You want to add to that?
I think that was exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah, and I think that, but I think it's a real issue, and I think that it's important to recognize that people come at this in good faith. I mean, they're not trying to. There's not people out there who have this intention. There are some, but there are not everybody you meet. Certainly not the people in your classes are out there trying to be anti-Catholic. They see two goals and they see that they conflict and they want to resolve that. And I would say that in the context we're talking about, religious liberty, we have our constitutional protections and our statutory protections for a reason. And that's because religious liberty is not just an individual right, as it is here in the context you're talking about, but protecting that individual and institutional right builds up the glue in civil society that keeps these institutions together. And so where rights conflict, we settle them we have tradition of settling them by giving opt-outs, by giving exemptions, by having other access, what have you. And that's the goal here, too.
Yeah, I guess what I want to just add is that when we're fighting for religious liberty, I think at the same time we have to fight for like a specific nomenclature, like a way of defining health, a way of defining truth,
right.
so that they can't, so that, like, I guess the people we discuss these things with are not going to necessarily say, well, then you can no longer achieve the health of your patient.
Right.
Because that really puts a provider in a bind.
Right.
Or an educator saying, you're not even willing to teach the truth to okay, well, now we're not even talking about religious liberty anymore. We're talking about something much more fundamental.
We're talking about how people characterize health.
I guess what I'm just saying is that there are ways for them to, come at these arguments.
I completely agree. And I think that's a great opportunity, though. Again, that's a great opportunity to witness, right? It's a great opportunity to say that pregnancy isn't a disease and that this is we consider this to be an abortion because we believe that life should be protected from its beginning to its end. And this is why we consider it to be a human life from that point. I think you're exactly right, that that's where the rubber hits the road and that that's our opportunity to witness. And that those situations, those personal interactions that you're engaging in with your friends and the other students or nurses, those are examples of times when your witness is most profound. And I think you're exactly right. It's a challenge, but it's a wonderful challenge to have. I think
that's
great.
Why Catholic Voices can't just be a bunch of lawyers talking.
Right. Exactly.
We need people from every profession, every walk of life, every experience, every background. And I would recommend to everybody in the audience, Austin Ivory, who is part of Catholic Voices UK and who trained us about a month ago in the Catholic Voices understanding of how to approach these issues, has written a really good book called How to Defend the Faith Without Raising Your Voice. And I would recommend that. And the idea of the book is, how do you engage people in these water cooler type conversations, or at the bar, or at the ballpark, where at lunch you just want to eat your lunch. You don't really want to get into a discussion about these, you don't want to have to think. You just want to do what you're trying to do. And he really sets up the framework of how you can see, like what Kim was saying, the positive intention. Like the people you're talking with, they really want to provide health for people. That's why they're going to school. That's why they're sacrificing other things that they could be doing. They're studying, they're spending money on their education. And knowing that when you enter a conversation with someone and being able to identify the positive intention between, what you see as a challenge to your faith, and maybe you feel like they're kind of picking a fight, I think it changes the frame of reference so that you can have a conversation with them that's not confrontational, that kind of mirrors back to them what they're saying and then changes it. Like, I hear what you're saying, but here's the Catholic view of it, or here's my view informed by my Catholic faith. And I think, as is true in most parts of life, you'll never win a debate. You just won't, because people have emotional attachments in their own background. But if you try to relate to people and understand it from your perspective and share and show love, then those are the conversations that you may not win in that time, in that lunch, but they'll come back to you when they have another issue and something else comes up in the news, and they'll say, oh, I remember you were talking about that. You know, what do you think about this issue? And it will open up a whole bunch of opportunities for you.
That's true.
Here.
This is very good. And I think it goes back to the whole issue of we need to, in the pro-life movement, which I've been involved for a long time, these issues about how to present and left brain, right brain studies, we need to go back and review those studies that showed that you need to have these conversations where you don't push people in the corner, and you let them, you give them an opening. It's, you know, a soft sell. It's a think about it type of thing where you leave it open, because when you come on with, you know, in fact, I've come to the point where I don't even like to say this is only about religious liberty, because it isn't only about religious liberty. It is about religious liberty and life issues. So we've got to make sure we don't sound like, you know, we're this mantra that this is only about religious liberty. If it wasn't birth control, we wouldn't be having this argument. So we have to be careful in how we present ourselves, and I think the more we can learn about marketing the ideas in a winsome way, as some of my Protestant friends like to say, and with the open, I'm very curious about the book, because I think that's exactly what we need.
It's probably for sale right now.
It's probably for Austin. Austin was here for a book event just a couple weeks ago, I think, selling this book. And Mary, I'm sure you all know Mary Ham, has headed Centro Tepeyac, which is one of these kind of social service providers that has been on the front lines for years and years doing this, and could be very much affected by this. And you make a great point, and that's this, that we have to know how to present these issues and talk about them. There's a great book right now called, besides Austin's book, which is wonderful and available right out there, called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. And it talks very interestingly about how to convince other people, while we're hardwired to think about morality and to really kind of impose our morality in a sense, want to get it out there, we have an intuition about morality, and we can't be convinced otherwise, and we want to convince other people. It talks about how to discuss this, and one of the rubrics that it uses is the rider and the elephant, and our moral intuitions are the elephant, and the rider on top is the argument that we use, and the rider's trying to steer the elephant, but really it's the elephant that's driving things, and you need to point to people's intuitions. I have a feeling that we're probably ready to get out there. Maybe we'll wrap it up now, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all. And yes, we also have that book, Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, is also out there as well. So we welcome you to come out and peruse the bookstore, enjoy some refreshments. Please come back and visit us. Check us out at cicdc.org, and you'll see right on the front of the homepage our HHS alert page. We have a Fortnight for Freedom action items and things, and more information about Catholic Voices, which I couldn't recommend more highly. So thank you all for joining us, Gail, Lauren, and Kim. And please join me in welcoming and thanking everyone.